All right. Welcome, Mike. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what we're going to be talking about today?
Again, I'm Mike Berznak from Answers in Atheism. I go by Speed of Sound oftentimes for various reasons. We do a little tiny channel where we babble incoherently about creationism, molecular biology, evolution. And lately, I have a bee in my bonnet about physicalism versus idealism and consciousness. And so we've been doing stuff on that in the last 6 months, losing viewers in the process, but it is fun. And I wanted to get together with you today and have a talk about two broad subjects, physicalism and consciousness, and a little bit of the meta about both of those things, the meta philosophy.
All
That's
right.
it. Yep.
Where do you want to start?
Well, yeah, should we start with physicalism?
Sure.
Okay. You said you and Pete Mandic both said you no longer identify as physicalists for what was the reason again that you would put up for that? Or am I putting you on the spot?
I don't know if there's an easy way, but whatever, I'll give it a shot. So, I have a few concerns. If one is simply saying, hey, physics, like the scientific study of the fundamental nature of reality from a physical perspective, like the reality as it is described by physics is our best account of what reality is like composed of, what the structural relations are at sort of the foundations of reality, protons, neutrons, electrons, quarks, and all the way down at the sort of lowest level of explanation. Physics is what provides the best and perhaps the exclusive explanation for what's going on there, how to make predictions, and provides us with the best models. In that sense, I'm a pragmatist. You could call me a physicalist. Pragmatically, I'm a physicalist in the sense that I think that physics does the best job of explaining reality at that sort of lowest level of explanation, at that most fundamental level. My concern, though, is when one wants to pivot from that sort of pragmatic characterization of the world, which is to say, okay, well, physics provides this foundational level of explanation for what the world is like and how it functions and what it's composed of. And we have these models and they allow us to make predictions and they tell us what the world is like in a certain sense. And then you have all the sort of sciences that are built on top of that. You've got chemistry, biology, psychology, right. And you get increasingly more abstract and you're dealing with increasingly more, you could say, diffuse patterns of the interaction of the fundamental stuff. Like I think reality is composed in a pragmatic sense of this stuff. That's all fine. The problem is with what philosophers want to do with that. I start having concerns if someone says reality is composed of physical stuff. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean the stuff as it is described by physics? How literal are we going to be? And I think for a lot of philosophers, it's meant literally. They are building or adding on top of, hey, physics provides the best description of fundamental reality. Cool. I think they want to add on top of that physics is describing this stuff that's out there, and that's the physical stuff. And I have a concern with that because there are pragmatic construals of saying, like, obviously I'm going to say that there's trees out there, there's clouds, and there's the sky. They exist. They're real. But I don't think that they're like made of stuff, and that stuff has some shared essence that is similar across all things, all stuff.
Right.
So it just seems to me to be committing oneself to additional superfluous metaphysical claims that I'm not willing to commit myself to. I don't know what Mandic's reasoning is. I don't remember, but that's basically where I'm coming from. I'm wary of basically what I'm doing when I sort of pick out the labels or positions, like what positions I'm going to call myself. What I do is I try to canvas the sort of general picture. I get like a gestalt of like what it is that the people that take positions on these things tend to commit themselves to. And if they commit themselves to extra stuff, even if it's just a few little extra things that aren't that big of a deal, I want to have a sparse and parsimonious and as clean of an ontology or a model of the world as I possibly can. And philosophers have a penchant for baking all this extra stuff in there. And a lot of the stuff that they're baking into there, I think, is this sort of residual legacy. It's this artifact of several thousand years of saturation in Western philosophy and Christianity. And I think that there's still a bunch of mystic mumbo jumbo that they're smuggling back in through the back door. And I think they often will slap scientific and mathematical and technical sounding labels onto mystical nonsense. And I don't want any mystical nonsense to get slipped into my positions. I don't want people to attribute mystical nonsense to my positions. And this happens in every area of philosophy. Now, I don't do a lot of metaphysics, but I have learned through bitter experience and discussions that if I say I'm a physicalist, then someone is going to start asking me, well, how do you solve this problem? How do you address this challenge? Right. And these are philosophical challenges that someone only faces if their conception of physicalism is one with these extra metaphysical commitments.
I lost you for a second.
Okay. That I don't share and that I don't endorse. So the short summary of it is, there are pragmatic construals of physicalism that I'm perfectly comfortable with. And if in the course of a conversation, it's clear that that's all you're committing me to, then I'm happy to call myself a physicalist. You could say I'm a pragmatic physicalist, or a methodological physicalist, or a functionally or instrumentally a physicalist. But this term, like many terms, there's this sort of a seizure of the meaning of the sort of conventional meaning or mainstream meaning of these terms within philosophy by analytic philosophers. And they, I think, have a tendency to taint this terminology with extra metaphysics. So that's why I'm wary of it.
Yep. And I think, I agree with that completely. Okay. So I came up with propositional physicalism because what I call that is the ontic fallacy, right? When, the stuff that we have in our ordinary life, like this cup, right, made out of clay, made out of, silicon molecules and silicon dioxide and all of that, we have this tendency to look for what things are made of. But even in physics, that only works at a certain level, at the level that we operate in, right? Within the frame of being this sized, we are a certain size in the universe. We are not neutrinos, right? Like people will say, oh, well, this is mostly empty space, right? And like, no, it ain't, because you're not a neutrino, right? You can touch it. You can't go through it unless you're a neutrino. So it's kind of the idea of perspectivalism, I think it is. Or is that the right word? Perspectivalism, yeah, that's how you say it. Anyway, it's from our basically in accordance with what we are. Okay, we interact with reality in a certain way, and that is reality with a lowercase r, not an uppercase r. Okay, if you look for the uppercase r, well, physicists do not know yet what that is. So we don't know what this bottom layer is. We know it's quantum fields, and we know that particles interact. But the bottom line is, when they interact at the level of the size that we are, they appear very solid. There are solid things in the world. So what they try to do is take that material idea, which is the ontic fallacy, and go way back and try to say, oh, everything is made of this stuff, right? But ask any physicist and he'll tell you, no, it's not. Don't work that way when we get a particle accelerator. So I came up with like methodological physicalism or propositional physicalism. And the reason that it hurts my feelings to hear you guys say you're not physicalists is because what is normally meant by that, I am not a physicalist. That means I am some version of an idealist, right? That I believe when it comes to mind and consciousness, and here's our segue, that basically there's, oh my goodness, that basically there's a, physical science can't explain the mind or can't explain consciousness, and that's where I get off the train, right? Because that's where we get into mysticism and we get into all this bullshit, this supernatural blah blah blah. there's something about our minds that are so special in the universe, that it can, that the entire unit, like Kastrup would say, the entire universe is made out of consciousness. It's like, no, I doubt it. I really doubt it.
Well, see, I think that stuff is, I mean, I like a lot of the people that do that kind of work, but I think the views themselves are absurd. They're unmotivated, and I have absolutely no interest in them. I'm not an idealist. And I can understand if somebody hears that you're like if I said I'm a non-physicalist, that does in many circles, I think among, like if I told scientists I wasn't a physicalist, they would think, oh, you believe in like woo-woo stuff or they might think that. If I say it around philosophers, they might also think, oh, okay, so when you reject physicalism, you probably think like the Mary's room thing, like Mary learned something new because there's this qualia, and it's not like they might think that I'm on the other side. So if you're not on this side, you're on that other side. And that's an unfortunate feature of the structure of the philosophical dialectic. And the issue is that part of what I'm reacting to is my opposition to what I take to be an objectionable, you could call it a sort of framing fallacy or framing problem. It's that analytic philosophers have spent the past century or so setting up dichotomies and structures and categories, and they'll say to everybody, look, we've decided that there's these 2 boxes or 3 boxes or 5 boxes, pick one. And if you're not in this one, you got to be in the other one.
Right.
And you've had these movements that have been around prior to that and during that and after that. You've had ordinary language philosophy, you've had Wittgenstein, you've had quietists, you have had pragmatists. Like the most famous thing that you'll get from William James, like when people start introducing classical, like Jamesian and Schillerian pragmatism, will be his story about the squirrel. He comes down the mountain. There's 2 sides that are equally, there's like exactly the same number of people on both sides that are arguing about this person and the squirrel running around the tree. And it's like, are they circling each other? Is the guy going around the squirrel? And the question becomes like, once you disambiguate the language of what's meant by the person going around the squirrel or whatever, the question becomes trivial. It's moot. Like, well, if this is what you mean, it's this answer. If you mean this other thing, it's the other answer. There's not a legitimate dispute here. It's just people it's people not resolving ambiguities in language and thinking that they have, they basically generating artificial, like ephemeral, basically a philosophical mirage. What seems like a legitimate philosophical dispute in metaphysics, but it's actually just people not being clear about language. And you'll see the same thing from Wittgenstein, the same thing from other philosophers, all pointing out that philosophers and analytic philosophers especially have been massively tripped up by language. And that those language problems have caused them to imagine that there's all these phantom metaphysical problems that we have to deal with. Now, that unfortunately has been imported by analytic philosophers, not only from idealism, and you have all these views. You have panpsychism. You have panpsychism, dualism, whether we're talking property dualism or substance dualism, all these metaphysical views. They've even imported that into their conceptions of physicalism. They do the same thing in meta-ethics, where they'll construe subjectivism and other sorts of things in ways where they'll bring the mystery back in even to most of the anti-realist positions and then say, you must pick one of these positions. And I reject all of them. And so if I say I reject error theory, non-cognitivism, and subjectivism, sometimes people in meta-ethics will go, you can't do that. These are the only possible options. Then you're a realist if you reject those. And no, I reject all of the categories. So what I'm trying to do is make very clear just how much I don't like all what I consider to be the bogus, time-wasting bullshit metaphysics that analytic philosophy has continued to prop up into the present. And unfortunately, that's creeped into their construal of physicalism. And so we have to be wary where when I say I'm rejecting that conception of physicalism, I'm rejecting a conception of physicalism where exactly the stuff I think you don't want has been brought into it. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah. As far as
repeated myself, unfortunately, but basically, what I'm looking at this from a sort of sociological thing where philosophers have they've said, here's what we mean by these labels. And then I want to distance myself from their labels not only because I disagree with the content of their labels, but because I object to them trying to rigidly structure all discourse in terms of their labels when their labeling approach relies on presuppositions that I don't share.
Right.
That's a big problem. And I think if you looked at what a lot of philosophers are saying about this stuff, you would have things to object to with what they say about it too.
I have a lot. Yeah. That's why I came up with propositional physicalism, because nobody had ever heard of it. And I get to at least respond, basically, like when they would say, oh, you're a physicalist, so you believe that there is no supernatural. And it's like, well, I don't know what the hell supernatural is. So how could I believe one way or the other about it, right? So I try to distance myself from that idea, that ontic fallacy, that, you know, that we have to have the body, that if I say I'm a physicalist, then I am required to account for the bottom turtle, and I'm not, because nobody knows what that is yet. You know, we don't, and it's probably going to be a long time before we figure it out.
So you've encountered exactly one of the problems that I encounter with the way a lot of analytic philosophers will operate, is that they, on their view, will think, well, if you think X, X must entail Y. And so if you think X, you're committed to Y. What if you disagree with them about X entailing Y? A lot of times they'll just, in discussions, just insist on these entailments or relations between one concept and another concept. And often these problems emerge because you could say, look, if you're just stipulating that by definition, X entails Y. So if I think X, I'm logically committed to thinking Y. Like if I want to conform with classical logic, whatever, fine. Then technically speaking, I don't endorse X. I endorse something very similar to X. I endorse X with an asterisk, X, but not in a way that entails Y. That's what I'm endorsing. I will tell you what I endorse. But what they'll do is they'll say, well, you use the label, you use the term. And so in virtue of how I'm using the term, you're committed to the logical entailments of the concept that I associate with the term, not the concepts that you associate with the term. So it's this like constant vacillation between the terms and the concepts that the terms refer to. And so much of it relies on conflating terms and concepts and trying to snare people by sort of equivocating between the two and trying to commit you to their use of words. And this is really, you know, facilitated by them insisting that words don't mean what you intend them to mean, that they have their own meanings independent of your like intentions. Right. And so this is facilitated in part by their views about language. So we have a problem here, which is that we are operating in a way adjacent to, but kind of stuck partially within, a highly corrupted philosophical discourse where philosophers have mangled language so badly that that we're suffering from the sort of a collateral damage of it, where we're stuck with their mangled discourse. And I don't know what to do about that. Because the moment you just stipulate by physicalism, you mean something other than their metaphysical nonsense, of course I'm not going to have a problem with it. So if you call it pragmaphysicalism and you're like, by pragmaphysicalism, I mean this, and you give a description, you can say, sure, I endorse that. Not a problem.
Yeah. A similar discussion that I had with Danny, like a real fight I had with Danny over Jerry Fodor and natural selection, kind of went the same way. And he kept insisting on syllogisms, I call them, you know, it has to be this way because we have this little syllogism, we have this little logical construct, right? And it's like, no, that's not what it is, you know, and it goes on and on. But consciousness is very much a victim of this kind of BS, particularly with it has to be phenomenal consciousness. What is phenomenal consciousness? And they'll come up with, well, it's the feeling of seeing the color red. Well, we never actually see the color red, for one thing. Like when you're looking at this cup, you're seeing highlights and you're seeing a kitty and you're seeing them hold, you know, a little heart. And I mean, they say about 3 seconds or 3 sentences about phenomenal consciousness, and they refer to Ned Block and Jackson and all the others, and then they move on to explain why it can never be physical, right? And I'm like, wait a minute, hold up, let's move back and tell me and try to get an idea of what this thing is that we're talking about. Like when we say we want science to explain consciousness. Well, we very well could do that if you could tell me what the hell you mean by it, what it is, right, that you want explained. And then when you start explaining things with neuroscience, right, like all these different theories, the integrated information theory is the most popular right now. What you're doing is you're explaining all the easy problems. And it's like, oh, you're just explaining the easy problems. Well, when you're done explaining all the easy problems, there isn't anything left. There is no phenomenal thing at the center of all this. And that's what drives me nuts. And what it is a hard problem of intuition that we, like when you explain why a log burns, right? What fire is, what is fire exactly, and what is smoke, and what's happening there. We're explaining something outside of ourselves, and we intuitively accept those explanations because we're so used to them. Well, we shouldn't, because when you actually look into what is happening with fire and smoke and all of that, there are still a whole lot of questions that people never ask, right? Like one time I had a moment where it's like, what the hell is a flame? And so I started looking into it, and there's like a mess of science behind what a flame is, but people just intuitively accept it because we're so used to explaining objects around us. And then when we try to turn that inward and explain consciousness, we run into a problem, right? It's like we get down to this bottom thing. It's, well, that doesn't make sense because we're trying to explain a moving target. And that is a big problem. There's I've got let me see if I can show it here. I've got this idea of ribbons. Okay, I don't know if I can see that exactly, but what I have here on top is the phenomenal story that we want explained, right? And on the bottom in that green bar would be all of the neuroscience or the physical things that are happening in the world around you and to your body and your mind, right? And like when you start seeing a red cup on the line on the left, okay, then you end up, you're seeing red, right? And the whole time I'm seeing red and trying to figure out what it feels like to see red. Red light is still coming into your eyes and you're still processing it. And then we come out and we ask the person maybe on the other line, are you conscious of red? Are you feeling the phenomena of red, right? And that's the line on the right. And what happens is they'll start to move along this line. The problem is that when you introspect seeing red over here, you have already moved off by a few seconds. So you have no idea what you were conscious of prior to the interviewer asking you, what was it like to see red, right? You see the problem. You can't ever catch that instantaneous moment of the phenomena of seeing red. And so what I did is I came up with the idea of, okay, let's come up with a scenario, right? Like, let's think of let's fabricate a story of a person having a conscious experience. And then let's draw some lines and figure out what's really happening in the brain. And you end up with a much richer sense of what we are trying to explain. And in that richer sense, you can come up with neuroscientific explanations that, for me, have intuitively turned that little knot or push that button, right, where I can say, oh, intuitively, I understand consciousness. Okay, but it took a while to get there. And we're not going to get there by word salad and by just hand waving at the feeling of seeing red or the feeling of being in love or whatever. Because humans never actually just experience one phenomena at a time. There's never been an instance in our lives where we have done nothing but experience the color red. And if we did, it would probably look a hell of a lot like nothing because there's nothing to contrast it with. You follow that?
Some of it. What is it what do you think of the people that you disagree with? Like, what kind of mistake are they making? Why are they making that mistake? Because, you know, to set this up a little bit, someone might say, look, I especially people that think that there's qualia, they might say, of course, I agree that you don't just experience red. There's lots of things. You're having a rich experience with lots of different types of qualia all at once. And when you asked me for a sort of phenomenal report, I actually have all kinds of qualia. And like, I would have to stop and focus or attend to one in order to start talking about it or referencing it or singling it out of this sort of rich panoply of experience that I'm having. But I do have all this qualia. So they might say that, and then they might say, so some of your objections are not objections to my view, because I actually agree with parts of that. But then they might go on to say that their view of things is like, look, there's all these sort of functional and relational features of the way that we experience the world. But that part of what's happening when we experience things is that when you explain all that stuff, when you solve all those easy problems, what they would say is that they have direct and immediate access on introspection to the simple fact that their conscious experience is characterized by not simply these relational and functional and sort of a communicable properties about the relations between their experiences, but that there are certain sorts of intrinsic qualitative features to each one of those components. And that's what the qualia are. So sure, when they see red in their visual field and they're seeing all these other things and they're hearing things and they're tasting things and they're smelling things and all that, they can still attend to and think about that red experience, and that they recognize on introspection that there's something qualitatively sui generis about that red experience, that they're not just experiencing red. There's a redness to the red. There's something about the red experience that is intrinsically itself, like it has an essence to it, and that doesn't have to be cast in religious terms or mystical terms, but it does have to be cast in non-physical terms, because that qualitative property of redness just isn't the sort of thing that could, in principle, be accounted for in scientific terms, because science gives us these like third personal describable models. You could write down science in a textbook and an alien could read it, but you can't write down redness in a textbook for anyone to read it, even your best friend. So that I think they might say something maybe sort of like that. So where are they going wrong?
The first part is the idea that you have direct access to it. You don't, because as soon as you access it, you've moved in time, and your brain has done a billion things, like in that 1 second or 200 milliseconds that passes, and now you're doing something else and something else and something else, and you can never catch up. You can never catch up with that instant where you access it. The only way to do it, like you're looking at red right now, the red kitty qualia cup, right? You're still looking at it. It's still coming into your eyes, but it's not the same experience at the moment when I asked you what is the phenomena of seeing red. Okay. We have moved on in time, and now I take it away, and now you're just left with an adumbration or a caricature of seeing red, right? So now you've moved it away. And we think we have direct access because we go into these higher levels of our, conceptual thought and mind. And now we've really bollocks the machine up because we've added all sorts of, red stoplights, and I have associations, and I have Jackson's Mary's room comes to mind, and all of that. So there is no point where you can access that instantaneous field of consciousness. So that's the first thing that you need to learn, is that it is processual. And then if you refer to Dennett spent a little bit of time on this, and he explained that those two lines that I had, right, diving down into the physical and the phenomenal, you go through the phenomenal and into the physical. Those two lines are not even necessarily in order. I mean, they can cross up. They're not one-to-one in time, right? Like if you drop a large rock on your toe, and you're looking at it at the same time, you will see it at the same time that you feel it. And that's not right, because it takes like I think about 400 or 500 milliseconds for that signal to even get there, another couple hundred milliseconds before you can become conscious of it. So something is wrong, right? Our minds don't work like that. We don't have this woo mind instantaneous access to what's going on in the world. And what I describe that as is a brush in time. Like if you look at my little diagram again, there's a broad brush about 200 milliseconds long that goes through this timeline. Maybe you can see my cursor here. But so you're going through it and you're experiencing something in like 200 millisecond chunks, but it gathers together everything that's happened in that 200 milliseconds and squashed it into one qualia. So there's no clear timeline between the physical and the phenomenal, right? It crosses over and it does all sorts of other weird stuff and it accumulates. So you have this processual thing and no one ever talks about that. And if they don't talk about that, then I don't listen to what they got to say about consciousness can't be explained. The whole point of it is to develop a different intuition, right? Because when we're looking at what is inside of our mind, we are not doing the same thing as we ordinarily do when we try to understand the world around us. Does that make sense? Push
Yeah,
back.
I mean, so, you know, a lot of there is a considerable work in like cognitive psychology that goes back several decades that has overwhelmingly demonstrated like the non-simultaneity of our sensory experiences, like some of the stuff you described, like your foot. And Dan Dennett covers this in Consciousness Explained in excruciating detail. He talks about like the phi illusion, where you have like an object, like the colored light appears to change color before the light is flashed on the other side, which, you know, is a sort of straightforward demonstration that sensory processing is doing the sort of like post-editing type stuff. And it's giving us a sense that this is what happened in the past. When like we know that that's not what happened because we set up the study. And two, what it seems like happened isn't what happened. But the seemings are sort of out of accord with like the physical reality around us. But they do create a nice, pretty picture. And this is what our sensory experience does. I mean, that like the phi illusion is like and I don't even know how accurate. I didn't even get into it. And I don't know, I think I accurately could just off the top of my head. I mean, this is something I read a while ago. But you have that, but you also have just like stuff like if you ask people about their visual field, it might seem like your visual field is this richly detailed image, but really it's not. Everything at the periphery is like, it's not as colorful as it seems. It's blurrier. It's lacking accuracy. If you look at a painting from far away where a person is drawn by like a blue smudge, which is their outfit, and like a smudge for their head, like in the distance, if you're looking at the picture, it's like, oh, look at all the rich detail. You get up close, there's no detail at all. So our experience. So, and then, things seem like we're hearing and seeing them at the same time. We're not. We're feeling and seeing them at the same time. We're not. So we have all this like sensory input at all times. Everything is out of accord. Oh, like your eyes are doing all these saccades, they're moving all around. But everything looks like if I turn my head, everything looks smooth when I look around. But actually, my eyes are darting everywhere. It's zigzaggy. But again, post-editing. We are seeing when we introspect this like mega edited product, and then people act like they're looking at the raw footage, and like we know they're not looking at the raw footage, and that matters. And it matters in the sense that it shouldn't push us to go, well, we can't know anything and we need to be radical skeptics. Rather, it's like you need feedback with an understanding of how, like, you're using an information process, like an interconnected set of information processing systems that dynamically interact with one another in all sorts of inscrutable and poorly understood ways that we only are starting to have the faintest glimmers of understanding. And you need to understand how that system works in order to calibrate or adjust your confidence and your introspection accordingly. And for me, learning some of these things, having even a rudimentary understanding of some of them. It's not like I understand like the science of perception or human cognition at any non-laughable level of detail, but even a cursory understanding that a lot of how things might initially seem is not the way they actually are. One would have thought that would, shake some humility into analytic philosophers, but it has not. And many of them remain stalwart in insisting that they have some kind of special access. And they do this for consciousness, they do this for metaphysics, they do this for epistemology, and they do it for ethics. They do it in every branch of philosophy. You just have these people with this disposition to have this unshakable confidence in the power of their ability to just go like this and think, and then they know what's true. It's bizarre.
Right. And that disposition has a little bit to do with where they want to go. Like if you look at Bernardo Kastrup, who's all over the place, right? What he describes is kind of physicalism, right? But he insists, no, it's all mind, it's all conscious, right? The disposition has something to do with what you want, where you want to go. And I did a stream last week called "The Woo Heads on the Left." You got the fundamentalists on the on the right, and you got the woo heads on the left at the top, and they want there to be something mind-like and spiritual, they call it, about the world. So if they have that thing where I insist that there's some phenomenon and I have first person access to it, you can't talk them out of it. And that's disposition. And that is sad, because we should be able to be talked out of anything, right? I mean, there's always a new way to look at it. Right?
I want to flag that point because I think it's an important point and it's a major concern of mine. I will sometimes hear people say stuff like they have Cartesian certainty of this or that thing. Like, if you break down everything, if you question all your assumptions, there's still some things you just can't doubt. Like they are incorrigible. And there are philosophers that will essentially say, I have Cartesian certainty. I am incorrigible about this issue. Like I am not capable of being persuaded otherwise. That might be true as a matter of psychological fact about people. But if I found myself in that situation where I found myself like, I believe this thing and I could not believe it, I would find that distressing and a troubling concern. But philosophers will say this like it's a badge of honor. Like, I have discovered the things you can't doubt. And that's our starting point. Like that's their Cartesian foundation. And that's a good thing. And just, I just don't view philosophy that way. And I almost don't see a point in having a conversation with a person that has that sort of view, if that the sort of things that they're certain about is the font from which their entire alternative philosophical worldview stems. Because to me, it's not functionally different from someone saying, look, I have Cartesian certainty that God exists and Jesus is his son and died for our sins. Right. Okay, well then I can't talk you out of Christianity. And so if the dispute is Christianity true, I can't make progress with that person. It might be enjoyable to talk to them. Maybe I could persuade an audience by talking to them, but that person is incorrigible. Now, I have big concerns about this, about philosophers going around saying this, because look, you can say all you want that you could, like, you've probably run into Christians that say, you couldn't talk me out of Christianity. It's impossible. And then they're an atheist 10 years later. Have you encountered this?
Yeah.
So people may feel incorrigible about something, but they can't even be certain of that. In other words, you don't have meta certainty about your alleged certainty. I have certainty that I have phenomenal consciousness. Does that genuinely, like, can you actually know that your mind couldn't change? I don't think that they do know this. So what they're reporting is some kind of sentiment or feeling that they couldn't be persuaded. They're not able to actually tell you, I know as a matter of psychological fact that I could not be persuaded. How could they know that? But when you go around saying, I'm certain of this and I couldn't be wrong, that you're setting yourself up. You're not just reporting descriptive facts retrospectively. You're publicly stating a kind of allegiance to a view. If a person privately is a Christian and they don't tell anybody, it's a lot less threatening to renounce their beliefs than if they go around saying, I'm a Christian and you could never talk me out of it. Because when they start having those doubts, now they made a public record. And so now when those doubts creep in, there's shame, there's embarrassment, there's humiliation in it. And so when philosophers go around announcing their Cartesian certainty and their incorrigibility, they are setting themselves up. They're putting themselves at odds with their own like future epistemic quality, like their own epistemic virtue, because they're creating additional ego barriers to potentially changing their mind. And so it's a bad thing for them to do it as a matter of course. If I'm, supposing I'm right about this psychology here, which I think is pretty plausible psychology. If you went around saying you're going to do something and then you don't do it, that's more
it
difficult.
hurts. Right. Yeah. Socially awkward.
Yeah. Right. And so, you have that problem. The other problem I worry about is that there may be a certain degree to which philosophers are right about this, and it could be the output of a method that they're using. And I worry that philosophers may be committed to or employ methods where they could talk themselves into positions that they're subsequently unable to or face massive challenges in talking themselves out of. You could kind of think of it as like a philosophical ditch or like a black hole, philosophical black hole, where once you reason your way into it, it's virtually impossible to get out. And what if the method is not a reliable method, people are locking themselves into positions that they can't get out of, and the positions are wrong. But then what they'll do is they'll take their irremovability from the position to reinforce their confidence in the position. Hey, look how strong my position is. You couldn't even talk me out of it. So my position's got to be right. I mean, that's ridiculous. Your personal incorrigibility is not a testament to how strong the idea is. There's lots of, like, your stubbornness isn't a virtue of the belief. It's a vice of your personality. And yet philosophers themselves will mix the two up and treat their personal developed incorrigibility as actual evidence that the view is true. That's ridiculous. They'll also, I think many of them would deny this, but I think in practice they operate this way. And you'll see this from the way, to give because I always go back to metaethics. Realists might say things like, any argument against moral realism would rely on premises that are less plausible than moral realism being true. So the premises are wrong. So if you argue against me, you're always going to have to appeal to points that are less plausible than my conclusion. So like that's a ridiculous thing to say. It's a ridiculous position to take. Because you're sort of you're using whether or not a view, like the argument is wrong because it disagrees with my conclusion. I mean, that's backwards reasoning. And yet philosophers will treat this as a completely sensible way of going about things. Now, they might say, look, I just have a strong intuition. It could be overridden by a defeater. But in practice, they'll just always treat their personal intuitions as evidentially overriding of any arguments to the contrary. It's de facto incorrigibility. And this is everywhere. And this is a big problem. I think this is a problem for everybody. It could be a problem that you and I encounter where we might be more stubborn than we should be. But I do think it's a distinctive problem. It's asymmetrically. It's like more of a problem for the more a prioristic, armchair, and rationalistically inclined philosophers because of the degree to which they are less susceptible to changing their views in light of empirical evidence. I think that they're just like more inclined to just say, my intuitions are right, too bad.
There's a parallel with certain atheists that will say, there's nothing that could convince me that there is a God. And then you say, well, what if, it appeared, love Jesus appeared, the stars rearranged to form, this message in the sky. Or Jesus came down to you and they'd say, well, I'd be thinking I had a hallucination or it was aliens or whatever. And I'm like, no. As far as my atheism goes, if Jesus or my mom came into this room, in eidetic form and talked to me, I'd be reading the Bible tomorrow. I mean, my mind can be changed on all of this stuff. In fact, I would love for idealists to come up with a coherent theory about the everything is mind. I would like them to explain how that works, and then they don't. So, but the thing about intuition, okay, we are absolutely driven by intuition because it's how minds work. Minds can't work any other way. You can't reason constantly, right down to the bottom turtle as you walk around. You're always relying on intuition. And intuition gets a bad rap, but we're stuck with it because it's how our brain works. We have built up certain structures in our brain to acquire reality as we do and come up with certain convictions as a result. And that is an intuitive thing, because intuition is like a super AI, right? If you look at how your brain works, it's very much like an artificial intelligence. It learns from millions of examples, and somehow it comes up with answers that are usually correct. And that's called intuition. So intuition is like this super advanced calculator that takes the best input and comes up with an answer, that sort of thing. You hate intuition, don't you?
I don't hate intuition. I hate the way that philosophers sloppily use the term, because if you're using the term to refer to like some specific types of cognitive processes where, look, right now, the majority of decisions I make, actions I take, things that I do, they're not the result of a conscious inferential process.
Right. Exactly.
I'm doing all kinds of non-inferential stuff, and I deliver all these outputs and all that sort of thing. And that's like, we have to do that. We're constantly doing that. But philosophers will lump in something like a judgment that they have about a philosophical matter. And they'll call that an intuition, and they'll call other sorts of things intuitions, without being careful about what they mean and how, if you want to call all these things intuitions, that's fine. You could call different forms of water. You could have a super category. But you need to be careful not to obscure the fact that if two things have the same super category, because two things are mammals doesn't mean they both have tails, So the fact that two things are, quote unquote, intuitions doesn't mean they have the same properties. It doesn't mean they're equally reliable. It doesn't mean they rely on the same cognitive processes. Philosophers will throw this term intuition around with zero regard for how it relates to any particular set of psychological processes and how those psychological processes might differ from other psychological processes that they're also calling intuitions. And so they're just not carving up the cognitive territory that's undergirding their use of this terminology in a clear or precise way. They're not even paying attention to it. They are treating what are clearly claims about how human cognition specifically works without any regard for understanding how human cognition works. That's ridiculous. It's ridiculous for them to do that. If they want to say that we have intuitions, they owe us an account of what intuitions are, how they work, what psychological processes are involved, how many different types of intuitions there are, how the psychological processes involved differ from one another. They don't do any of that. They just treat intuition like this human cogitation just doesn't rely on a brain. That and we need to understand how it works. It's like someone going around talking about movement or travel in vehicles, and they show no regard for the method of travel, how wheels work, how combustion works, how different types of engines work. Is it a steam engine? Is it electric powered? Is it solar powered? If someone just kept insisting that travel had these properties, like the engineers would be like, which kind of travel are you talking? Are you talking about flying or swimming, going underwater, like these all differ and they have different properties, and the differences between them matter. Philosophers pay no attention to those differences. And it's a problem, because there may be cases where we're talking about perfectly sensible, reliable, functional, or necessary or unavoidable uses of intuition, and certain cases where philosophers are adding extra evidential weight to some judgment that they're making in a philosophical context that, on reflection, were they to understand the underlying cognitive differences between these different systems, and they're like, we're using the seventh system in this list of systems, that system actually isn't reliable, then they might question their intuition in that case. But they don't know what they're dealing with, a psychological black box that they are not bothering to look at or try to figure out its inputs and outputs. And they're basically showing no regard for how their own reasoning processes actually work at a functional level. And they're acting like that doesn't matter. And that is what I take issue with. So am I opposed to intuition? No, I'm opposed to any case where philosophers rely on empirical, psychological, and other sorts of like scientific claims about how brains work or how the world works, but show inadequate concern for the actual details and how those details might be relevant.
Right. Yeah. When I use the word intuition, I mean it as it's a common word, ordinary word, and it is supposed to wave at a particular process in our brains, basically. that happens, and it has to do with how our brains operate. And we operate in order to act, right? Like I'm operating right now in order to speak. And intuition is involved in that. And it's not a good technical term. It's a very big blanket term. But when you actually look into how brains work, you know that we don't reason much when we do things. We rely on this blanket cognition called intuition. And so does AI. We'll train up AI by showing it a whole bunch of pictures of cats, right? And then it intuitively says cat all the time. But when you look at how, if you were to detail all of the weights of all of those different connections in those layers in an AI, you would end up with a mathematical nightmare, and you still wouldn't know what the hell a cat was, right? You don't know what a cat was, but somehow it gets cat right 99.9% of the time. And that's how we work, you know? So when you, I mean, are you saying that okay, Bernardo Kastrup uses intuition to support some of his ideas, right? He uses it as an argument, and that is ridiculous because you just can't do that. Intuition is not trustworthy to the point where you can come up with a rational conclusion based on an intuition. Would you agree with that?
Intuitions were generally trustworthy. A lot of times philosophers will not make clear when they talk about intuitions whose intuitions they're talking about. So when I talk to realists, realists will just presume realism is intuitive, and they'll say, well, my position is the intuitive one. And so insofar as intuitions are thought of as generally reliable, their position is presumed to be true because it's the intuitive position, unless you have good reasons to override the intuition. But I don't share their intuition, and that's where a lot of the problems emerge. Is, you know, let's say a person's intuitions justify their personal belief. Okay, well, what happens when I have contrary intuitions? Now what? So you have intuitions that lead you to believe X. I have intuitions that lead me to believe not X. Now what do we do? And a lot of times philosophers that endorse the more metaphysically robust positions, the more realist-oriented positions, operate under the presumption that their positions, like, quote unquote, are the intuitive ones. And so I'm told, like, I don't have contrary intuitions. I must have the intuitions that's one of the things they'll tell me. I must have their intuitions. So I don't like those musts. Philosophers do that sort of thing. The other thing that they might suggest is that they'll say, well, you have unusual intuitions. You're the less common. That's an empirical claim. They don't tend to support their claims with empirical evidence. It's another problem that they run into. The third is if they think, like, even if they set those aside, if they're justified in their intuitions and I'm justified in my intuitions, what's that getting us? You know, like, okay, so you're justified and I'm just, what work is justification do? Like, you're allowed to believe it? Allowed by who? So, like, even this very notion that philosophers want to chase after, which is justification for belief, I think it's a non-starter. I think it's ridiculous. Justification. They're importing, like, theological ideas here. I think that you need someone's approval to believe it. I don't need the universe's approval to believe things. I'll believe whatever it is I believe, and we'll see what happens. That's my approach. So a lot of the ways that philosophers use intuitions is they use them within a closed loop of, like, basically they have this like axiomatic little game, like it's got its little rules. And so, okay, so you want your beliefs to be justified. How can they be justified? You need to meet these conditions. I do meet the conditions, so my belief is justified. What the hell does that get you?
Right.
What do you do with that? So how let's say one person has a bunch of justified beliefs and the other person has only unjustified beliefs, but there's no practical difference. They both navigate the world equally well. Like, you know, one person's a skeptic that believes knowledge is impossible and we're not justified in believing anything, but on purely, like, pragmatic grounds. So, like, I don't even believe in justification, but I believe things on pragmatic grounds, and they believe all the same things. They're going to get the same outcome. So this is why I think a lot of this circles back to pragmatism, which is that I think philosophers want to jump through a bunch of verbal hoops and think that they're achieving something of intellectual importance, but they're not achieving anything of practical importance. And I think the two ultimately just converge. That the only intellectually interesting considerations are practical considerations. And that's why, for me, it all comes back to pragmatism.
Yep. That's like the Dr. Seuss's East Going Zacks and West Going Zacks. I don't know if you've ever read
I
that
don't recall
story to
that
your
one. Can you
kids.
tell me about it?
Oh my God. Let's see. It's all right. Maybe it's the North Going and the South Going. Okay, the Zacks with a ZAX, basically. Let's see. I've got a little shot here. It is wonderful. Oh, here they are. You can't hear it, but let's see. Can you hear that? No, you can't hear
No.
that. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. So let me show you. Okay. Oh, where's the East Going and the West Going Zacks? Oh, is this it? Yeah, Dr. Zeus Zacks. Okay, there they are. And they're like, I read this to my kids. I had twins, right? And they would fight. And when they fought, I would read them this story. There's the East Going Zacks and the West Going Zacks. And they can't resolve this problem because they're just facing each other. Anyway, it's a wonderful Dr. Zeus thing that you should read your kids every time they fight. Anyway, I like it. But yeah, so the thing is that, okay, if you look at political affiliations in the 2024 election, right, I have some friends that are totally in opposition to me. And they are so certain. They are so absolutely certain. They will convince me that I am being brainwashed by the liberal media and the fake news and all of that. And I want to tell them, you're being brainwashed by Fox News and all of that, right? But when they do that, when they have that conviction, what that does to me is it makes me sit back and look as hard as I can at what I'm presupposing, at what my intuitions are, at what my beliefs are. I don't look at their beliefs because they're insane, right? I look at my own beliefs and try to justify it over and over and over again. And I would do that with anything, with physicalism, with atheism, with anything. You know, I'm I don't know, some atheists have a particular aversion to certain words like prayer and supernatural or spirit or spiritualism. And I am very much a spiritual atheist who prays. And I love that because it sort of breaks the mold, right? And when you break the mold, you start to examine what your beliefs are and you know, what works and what doesn't work. So like when I pray, and I have for years and years and years, what I'm doing is I'm changing my psychology. I'm changing what I do in my mind and in my body, and I call that prayer. And what it does is it changes me, you know, synaptic plasticity, right? So I use that word, but anyway, if you try to break those molds by using some of the opposite terminology and then come up with justification for it, it is kind of a cool way to do philosophy, I think. But I'm always in doubt of what I believe, constantly. So, which I
There's
think
some
is a good
things
attitude.
yeah, I mean, it can't. There's some things. It depends what you mean by always in doubt. There's some things that I'm very confident about, and there's no like.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess it depends on what you mean by doubt. Like I
Pragmatic.
wouldn't want to be in a state of like existentially second
No,
guessing and third
no,
guessing, and I can't make decisions because I'm in doubt. But it's like I could be wrong about that. I have that
no.
about everything. I could be wrong about
Okay,
everything.
that's where faith comes in, and
Well, I wouldn't
intuition,
say that.
right?
I don't think I have faith in
I
anything.
know, I know, but I do. I have faith in the thinking I've done prior, the reading I've done prior, the work I've done to examine my own beliefs. I have faith. I have faith that there's a cup here, that there's a red kitty qualia cup, and I have faith that I'm talking to Lance, and I have faith in a lot of things. Like 99.9% of my quick intuitions rely on this pragmatic realism that exists in a Cartesian coordinate system and obeys the laws of physics, right? And I believe in that and I trust it 99.9% of the time. But there's that 0.1% that I will always give to the other side, where I will re-examine how I got to those beliefs and how I got to that confidence. So what happens is people will say, What I really hate about philosophy of the mind is when they talk about the unreliability of the senses. Well, shit, if my senses were unreliable, I wouldn't be alive at 73 years old. They're really reliable because I have existed for 73 years, fed myself, walked around the room, operated, talked to people. So 99 points, you don't throw out realism because there's a couple of illusions that you had, right? So and that gets back to the pragmatic realism with a lowercase r. Does that make sense? Which I think you kind of
So
agree
far,
with.
yeah. And
Yeah,
I agree with all that.
But there's
Yeah,
always that.
You go ahead.
I think you've okay. There's always that point. I wasn't sure if you froze or you were waiting for me. There's always that 0.1% that you have to throw up and say, okay, maybe you're right, maybe I'm wrong. And I always try to do that on a daily basis. But then you reason again and you figure out and you become confident in your position at the end of the day. It's the best we can do.
That's very healthy because I think if you close yourself off to actually considering that you could be wrong, like you become incorrigible. That's the path I don't want people to go down.
Right.
There's an exception to this, which is there are a range of positions where I think that they're so incoherent or unintelligible that I don't know what it would mean for them to be true. So I have a rough sense of what it would be like for like Christianity to be true. Like angels might come out of the sky. Jesus could show up and talk to me. But
oh God, that would be great.
Well, depending on what kind of Jesus we end up getting. So like if it's a benevolent,
bad Jesus,
really loving Jesus, then that's cool. But it's really going to depend. I agree with some of the other stuff. I might be a little tough to convince of Christianity. Like if I saw the stars arrange themselves in the sky, I don't think I would immediately believe because maybe that's some sort of mirage or illusion or hallucination from my point of view or whatever. But like if it's been a few weeks and astronomers confirm the stars actually did move and like they all over the world, everybody's panicking about it and everybody keeps seeing it. Now I have all this sort of constant, perpetual external corroboration. And that's where I'm going to go, okay, let's break out the Bible at that point. So I'm not unconvincible.
Have you watched Three Body Problem yet?
I haven't yet, no.
Oh boy, you got to watch it because it will click when you do with this conversation. So anyway.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, it's just, my view of evidence is very holistic. So like one-off experiences are probably not going to be very compelling, but when they become a recurrent, so if like one person appears to heal a person from that had been injured or bring someone back from death, that might not convince me because I might think one-off, maybe coincidence, maybe illusion, maybe I hallucinated. But if it became a regular part of everyday life, I would have very little reason for doubt. Like if we existed in like a Dungeons and Dragons type world, and there's all these different people that are priests and clerics of this or that god, and they regularly, like if someone follows the god of battle and they go like they make a prayer and they suddenly summon a big flaming axe, and all the priests of the god of war can do this, I'm gonna continue to not believe. That'd be silly at a certain point. So like there could be enough evidence where I'd be like, okay, it's kind of silly to not believe this. So I'm not unconvincible. I don't know what my point with that was though. So there are claims that I find incredibly improbable, but they make enough sense. Like people coming back from the dead doesn't like literally not make sense to me. So sure, certain aspects of Christianity could be true, but other ones I'm not so sure about, like the concept of the Trinity. If it's genuinely nonsensical, I don't even know. Like I couldn't be like, maybe they're right about that. Maybe there's a 1% chance. A 1% chance of what? So like if you take a literal nonsense phrase like blibbity blibbity blue, like I wouldn't say if someone is going around insisting that we all agree that blibbity blibbity blue, I'm not going to say maybe they're right about that. I'm going to say that's nonsense. Conditional on that meaning something, then I guess I would assign some non-zero probability to it. But until that day comes, I don't have a means of doing so. Like I can't say how plausible I find it that blibbity blibbity blue is true. But I could say that for even like, what do you think the probability that, and you come up with some coherent but extremely ridiculous thing, like it's going to rain hippopotamuses all over the world for 1,000 years. Very unlikely. Totally logically coherent.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Christianity. So many things. So many things wrong. I had a wonderful upbringing. When I was 15, I had a grand mal spiritual experience, and that changed. Fortunately, I was an atheist before, during, and after. So I had a secular interpretation of what a spiritual experience is. So I had an introduction to that. I've had grand mal hallucinations as a teenager. Basically, I had, and then I did a bunch of, I over medicated myself to the point where I actually had hallucinations. So I understand that what a hallucination is like. So when people tell me that, oh, it could be a hallucination that I'm talking to you right now, I'm like, nope, it couldn't, because that isn't how hallucinations work. They don't work like that at all. They're not eidetic, right? So I had this like wonderful bit of experience with, and the other thing, when it comes to sensory perception, LSD, very early, when I was 19 to 24, I had a number of LSD experiences. And I realized that under LSD, you don't do that thing where you fill in the peripheral, right? You don't do that. If you take enough LSD, that thing where you fill in your sensory perception, it goes away. And you get like this raw input, and tables wave up and down and walls melt. And as your eyes saccade, you will see different things. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is I've had a rich bit of psychological experience that has helped me and served me very well in these little bits on consciousness and understanding what the mind does. So
do you think, what about those particular kinds of experiences have influenced your views on consciousness, just to try to bring this back on topic?
I think where consciousness started to make sense with me is when I started reading about what the brain does, what it's actually doing. And I found this correlation, right? And I find correlation between what they tell me psychedelics do and what I experience on psychedelics. So that led to, well, the other thing is it tells you how easily you can alter your consciousness in different ways. But what really locked it all in for me and made me a scientist and a physicalist and a hard naturalist and whatever is reading about the mind and finding out that there was such a correlation between what is happening in your brain and what is happening in my subjective experience. And they'll say, oh, correlation is not causation. But if you don't come up, like, correlation oftentimes is causation, unless you have another probable cause for that thing, right? And we don't for the mind. All we have is the brain, right? So it is causation, and that's why I have a physical grasp on consciousness, because of what I've learned about the brain. And I did some of that subjectively with LSD. That matches too. So
do you think LSD improved your understanding of philosophy of mind or consciousness?
Yeah, I think so. I think it gave me a richer bed of subjective experience to develop from. But other than that, no, it didn't really illuminate things. I mean, it could have, like, if I had been some sort of a woo head back when I had those experiences, I could have come up with all kinds of BS. I mean, it wouldn't have. It didn't.
That would be one concern. Is like you have these different experiences, and maybe for some people, like, is it that if you have these experiences, given your current state of mind, they could enhance your understanding, they could do nothing, they could harm your understanding. Right. And then the question would be like, what's the overall, like, under what circumstances does the help or the harm occur? And like, basically, I'm wondering the practical consequences. Because like, if the idea is that philosophers should all take a bunch of psychedelics, I don't know if that would have good consequences or bad consequences.
No, it wouldn't. No. There's I don't know if you've ever had Kafei, Kafei, in your chat. Almost everybody's been plagued by Kafei. But he insists you take mushrooms and you'll find God. You know, he just insists on it, right? And no, if you're not presupposed to find God. You will not find. I hope you can't hear my cat snoring. I don't know.
Yeah.
Good. Hopefully my mic cuts him. Boy, I don't know what's wrong with him. Sleep apnea. Anyway, yeah, but it's given me a richer bed of subjective experience. And then when I started looking at what it actually does in the brain, what we know about it today, it makes so much sense as to what's happening. You know, it's lighting up your cortex and shutting down that default mode network that is what keeps us thinking that we have this grasp of what's in our peripheral vision and all of that stuff. So anyway, it all makes sense. But I think my request for idealists and people that are, you know, of the idealist bent on consciousness or dualists or whatever, is that you sit down and draw a little ribbon and think of a scenario, an experience, right? A test experience that we can talk about, and that you actually think about what you can and can't know about it. For instance, if I ask you right now what you were conscious of 1 minute ago, there's no way in hell that you have empirical evidence that holds up, that tells me if you were even conscious. If you look at Susan Blackmore's article in, what is the name? Carl, oh my God, I forgot his name. Pete Mandic did an article in his book. He's an illusionist. Keith Frankish, right? The illusionist. And Pete did an article on quietism, which is, I won't swear on your channel, but basically shut the hell up about consciousness is sort of what quietism is. Illusionism is a little different, but anyway, Susan Blackmore did an article that claimed that we are not conscious at all until we stop and think about it. That's when you're conscious. And I don't know if I agree with her or disagree with her, but she's got a point. You have no evidence of what you were conscious of 5 seconds ago or 10 seconds ago. There's no way. You have a memory of it. You have something that's being drug up from your neurons, you know, that have recorded your short-term memory, but you don't really know what you were conscious of. And for that, I have a scenario called basically the it's the dancing monkey and an apple in a chamber, a dark chamber, where they show you just an apple. That's the only thing that you can see, and there's a light shining on it. And you start asking the person, okay, what were you conscious of prior to that, prior to the light going on, when the light turned on, and tell us all the things you're conscious of. Well, they might have been thinking about lunch, right? And they're going to tell you they were conscious of lunch, but were they? What is their proof? What is the evidence that we were conscious a moment ago? There's something related to this. Like when you wake up from a dream, okay, for the first 15 or 20 seconds, you confabulate a story, a narrative that explains that dream to yourself, and then you will remember your dream. But you have no evidence that you actually had that dream when you had it, and not when you confabulated the narrative. There's no way to prove that. Do you follow that the connection?
Mm-hmm.
That we
yeah, Dennett
know.
gives a similar example in Consciousness Explained.
Yeah, I can't remember which example that was, but I read the book twice.
It's the one with like it's like Stalin-esque. I can't recall the dichotomy off the top of my head.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, so the thing is that the only way to do it is to come up with these scenarios and and I think the only way to make any progress is through neuroscience. And that's the other thing. Scientists haven't explained consciousness. Well, if you talk to Tononi and the integrated information theory and a few other people that have done current research on the neural correlates of consciousness, there are a lot of scientists that are beginning to think, yes, we have explained it. We've explained it more than you think, right? So I mean, you got to read the current research.
I don't know what to make of all that. I'm not familiar with those theories, but I still feel like offering neural correlates of consciousness, at least a bare bones approximation of what that would mean, is not going to tell us everything we would want to know about consciousness, because
No,
it's,
but if you add
there's
to it,
more work to be done. I mean, consciousness, you're going to like, there's going to be all this other stuff that you're going to need to explain. And a lot of it is going to be basically a whole bunch of stuff. Like, I want to know stuff about, if you break down what you mean by consciousness, how consciousness develops in humans, how it develops in non-humans, what those differences are. Not simply what the neurological differences are between this or that person under this or that circumstance, but you need to, I mean, the correlates of consciousness. I mean, so you have these particular neural states, and they correlate with what exactly? What is it that they need to correlate with?
Right.
And that's the end on which I think that a lot more work needs to be done. There's I think often too much presumption among researchers that, like, the other end of the explanatory, the other end of the explanation that we need to do work on is settled or doesn't need to be settled, or isn't itself a major philosophical issue. So what are the neural correlates of consciousness? When they say that there's these neural correlates of consciousness, what do they mean by consciousness in these various accounts? What is it that they're correlating to?
Well, they'll show you these dots, right? And you see these dots, and you focus on one in the center, and you can see there's like 3 red dots around you. And then if you focus on it long enough, one dot will disappear at the periphery, and then another one will disappear. Well, they've been able to measure what happens in the brain exactly when one is there and when one is not there, right? And they'll call that a neural correlate of consciousness. But that's not all. What you want explained is all of the many things that minds do, right? I mean, there's more.
Well, so among other things, for me, consciousness is, for humans at least, is something that it's not simply that I have certain types of visual experiences and I'm conscious of certain aspects of, like, visual inputs, and the same for other sensory inputs. It's also that if I'm introspecting my experiences, and then I introspect on previous experiences, and I think about future experiences, there is a sense of identity or continuity across time in those experiences. And that seems important to me. And it seems like an important element of my conscious experience, at least. I mean, what would it even mean to say it's my conscious experience? It's happening to me, and my other conscious experiences also happened to me. So a sense of continuity of identity seems not like an essential element of what must be a part of any stream of conscious thought, but a stream of conscious thought in which, in other words, like a series of reports on one's conscious experiences would be a very different thing if they weren't of a continuous, like an entity over time, where there's some persistence of identity. And so that seems like an important element to me. Again, I'm not saying it's essential. If you don't have a sense of personal identity, then you're not conscious. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that the flavor of consciousness I experience, that's a big part of it. Do all non-human animals have the same sense of identity as humans? If not, then the way in which their conscious experiences unfold may be very, very different from our own. And there may be differences between people that we're not aware of because of differences in how they've structured a sense of identity. Now, if our sense of identity and continuity through time is something that is partially learned or culturally mediated, that could be an important factor here. It could be that culture shapes the nature of human conscious experience. It sort of fleshes out some of the contours or characteristics of it in ways that would not be captured in a lab, because you might be doing research exclusively on people from one culture and not another. So that could be a problem.
Right.
Or because you're looking at aspects of conscious experience that are occurring under artificial lab conditions, but conscious experience as it's unfolding in a dynamic social interaction in the real world could be qualitatively distinct. There could be elements of the nature of consciousness that you're missing by only looking at lab experiences. And so my concern here is that we're not capturing the full spectrum of what conscious experience is like for humans in a culture speaking a language, and how that differs from non-human animals that their consciousness is very different. And I doubt we have a robust account in all of these cases. And like, you have another big problem with, if you're going to do consciousness research on non-human animals, they can't talk. So self-report is out the window. And that is going to massively limit what you can do research-wise. There's also going to be ethical issues about what you could do, both for humans and non-humans. So we have a bunch of practical, ethical, and ethical constraints on what we can study and what we can have access to. Studying visual perception, conscious visual perception in a lab is giving you a very tiny slice of what the human conscious experience is like, I guess, is the short version of what I'm saying.
Yeah. So to respond to that, we have to talk about reductionism. This idea of reducing things to, it's just neurons or molecules in motion, right? That's a conceptual explanation for things like fire and, things that are common out there, right? But when it comes to the mind, you don't use reductionism. You have to use constructionism, which is where you'll start out with, the basics, right? The structure of the brain, the experience, what the brain is doing, and all of that. And then you have to add all of these layers in cognitive neuroscience, right? Layer upon layer, interacting from one level to the other. This idea of hierarchies, there's both top down and bottom up, and there's jumps between different layers and all of that. And you build up the entire case of what the brain is doing, and that still isn't enough. That's where you get in Pete Mandick's latest book. He added a chapter on the 4 E's, basically, which is embedded, inactive, I think embedded, inactive, and extended. And there's another one, I forget what it is. Not sure. Oh, embodied. So it's embodied, inactive, embedded, and extended, right? Now, then you go outside yourself, what you are as an organism, and that's where you'll start to get an idea of what it is, of what you mean when you say there's this continuity, right? This continuity of your organism, of what's happening. But anyway, to explain it, like they'll say, explain consciousness. It's kind of like the creationists saying, well, explain to me how a liver developed. Explain to me how a liver evolved. And it's like, okay, let's start at the beginning. And it's going to take me 4 hours to even broadly sketch in how a liver developed, right? It's the same way with consciousness. If you want consciousness explained, sit your ass in a chair and listen for about 2 years, or start reading all the information that we have right now on it, and then you will have your explanation. But I can't give it to you in a one-liner. I can't just give you the intuitive feel if you don't have the intuitive feel. Does that make sense? So it's not reductionist, it's constructionist. I mean, we are an incredible mass of 27 trillion cells interacting in a world that is much bigger than that. And all of that is what's going into what makes you qualitatively conscious right now. It doesn't stop at your skull, your brain or your body. It goes all the way into whatever is locally influencing you right now. And asking me to explain that, in a half-hour conversation, not going to happen. Okay. I'm going to have to sit down and listen for a long time. Anyway, I would like to make some progress on that. And I think one of the ways to make progress on that is to hold philosophers accountable. When they say, phenomenal consciousness, it's what it is like. Well, when you say what something is like, I could say rhino is kind of like an elephant, right? When I say what it is like, ... what am I comparing it to? Right? So I'm not going to let them get away with that.
Like when you say what it's like, so when you say, a rhino is like an elephant in some ways, and it's like a hippopotamus in other ways. So that's a relational use of like. It's a perfectly sensible use. But that's not what they mean. They mean a non-relational type of it's like.
Yeah, so, the non-relational, which I don't understand.
You don't understand it because there's nothing to understand. It's nonsense.
Right.
So
exactly.
They will move between all these, what it's like. There are completely coherent, defensible, everyday uses of what it's like. what it's like to go, what is it like to go to Paris? Oh, I'll tell you what it's like to go to Paris. It's like this. And then someone can tell you. So that's the communicable form of what it's like. That's a perfectly sensible thing. But philosophers will do this trick. And it's a trick that the worst kinds of debaters will use. And then philosophers will do it too. Which is, if you say, well, what do you mean by that? They'll go, you don't know what it's like means. And then they'll give you examples of the completely sensible uses. So, if I question a philosopher about what they mean by good or conscious or real or actual, they'll go, you don't know what actual means. It's when someone says, oh, you don't know what such and such means. What are they asking me? Like, because I use the term, and in most everyday contexts, when a person uses the term, I'm not like, I have no idea what you mean. Like if someone said, hey, is Frank actually going to go to that party? And you said, well, I'm not going, what do they mean by actually?
Right.
I could tell you what I think that they mean, and they probably go, yeah, that's what I meant. But philosophers will then take that language. They'll take modifiers and adjectives and nouns like real or actual or truly and various types of language. They'll employ it in a different context.
Yeah.
And then you won't know what they mean in that context. So when you say, what do you mean? You're not saying, I am completely clueless as to what that word could mean in any context. I don't know what the word means. I'm stupid and I don't understand basic English. Yeah. You're asking, what do you mean? And so the issue that I think philosophers have is they treat these words like they have fixed meanings. And they'll also act as if, or seem to, I shouldn't say act as if, because that implies that they're not being sincere. And I think that they are. They will treat these terms as if they are the ordinary terms. I'm just using the term in its ordinary sense. So surely, since you know what that means, you know what I mean. And I don't buy that. I don't buy that I know I don't buy that they're using it in the ordinary sense. And I could still ask, okay, well, what do you think that the ordinary sense is? Because maybe I think it means one thing and you think it means another. I've had disputes where I'm like, well, what do you mean by that term? And they'll say, I mean what it ordinarily means. And I'm like, yeah, but what does it ordinarily mean?
Right.
And then they'll go, well, whatever it ordinarily means. And I'm like, okay, so you don't know what it ordinarily means? Like what, is there content to that claim, in other words? Like when you say I'm using, like if someone says, like if you ask someone, what do you mean? Okay, here's a really simple example. If you ask someone what time it is, and they're like, well, the time it shows on the clock, and they look down at their watch, right? Like it's the time it shows on my watch, and you go, okay, but what time does it show on your watch? They could respond with, well, whatever the time is it shows on my watch, that is the time that's displayed on my watch.
Yeah.
That's not helpful to me. I mean, is it like 2:22?
Right.
Like what? Tell me the time. So people will play these verbal games. Sometimes this is non-philosophers, sometimes it's philosophers, but a lot of the non-philosophers, they're picking this up from the way that a lot of the way philosophy operates. So this brings us back to the beginning of our conversation with why I don't like physicalism as a term. And I don't like it because philosophers have ruined the term. They ruin everything they touch with their weird, pedantic use of language. And for me, it's going to keep coming back to that.
Yeah. It's like the words real, right? And certain. They'll say, no, real. What is real? And they mean it with a capital R. And I sort of think what they're talking about is religion. It's kind of a religious belief that there's this underlying reality somewhere out there, right? That we're going to get to that bottom turtle. And I'm like, no. I'm going to drag you back to real means that this is a cup and I can touch it. That's it. Period. Lowercase r. Yeah.
You sound like a pragmatist because it.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
I mean, that's how I use the language, but
it's not so much an active pragmatist as that I've given up on certainty. I mean, I've had it beaten out of me, basically, right? I've been beaten into pragmatism.
Well, I think a lot of people, if you push, you'll find, you scratch the surface of a metaphysician and you'll find a pragmatist lurking there, at least much of the time. I'm not going to say all the time. I think that there's true believers of all sorts of things. But I think that there's pragmatism frequently lurking beneath the surface for a lot of things. I'm shifting towards this view of disagreement, where the way that philosophers construe disagreement is it's so formalistic and logical, and I mean that in a derogatory way in this instance, like in a negative way. Disagreements are like you think X is true, and I think it's true that not X, as if anybody would ever just argue about what is or isn't true without some underlying purpose or reason, or like, why are we arguing about this? And in any given case, people are going to have a reason. Even if the reason is, I enjoy arguing about what's true. That's what if they hated doing it and they didn't want to, why are they, like, it would make sense for them to voluntarily be engaged in a philosophical dispute. So people have motives, and those motives are what's prompting an actual disagreement. This is another case of here's it. Okay. Right now, like, I don't believe in God. We could find someone somewhere in the world that does believe in God. Do we disagree about whether God exists? Well, there's one sense of disagreement where a disagreement can be understood as this non-social thing. A disagreement simply describes any instance in which two or more people have contrary views about some specific issue. That's like a non-social disagreement. But then there's like an actual disagreement, like you and I disagree about a specific thing and we're arguing about it. We have a disagreement in the sense that it's not simply that we happen to have contrary views, but we're actually engaged in a discussion about those contrary views. And so that's a different sense of disagreement. So there's like a, I don't know if you want to call them a hypothetical and an actual disagreement, or a third personal or a non-social or a social disagreement. Like, there's different ways of construing it. Philosophers will treat disagreements like all instances of disagreements are only that kind of third personal detached disagreement. A disagreement is any instance in which two people hold contrary views about what's true. But there's social disagreements where we're actually having a conflict. And what I'm saying is that in any instance in which two philosophers are actually arguing about something, there's more to what's going on than simply the mere descriptive fact that people hold different views about what's true. And so philosophers will talk about real or actual disagreement. Like, real or actual disagreement is two people holding contrary views about what's true. So what's going on when you and I are arguing about something? That's not an actual disagreement. It's not a genuine disagreement. Those are the only disagreements that ever manifest or occur in the world. In other words, the only disagreements that take place or are events, I'm trying to avoid this saying actual. The only disagreements that manifest as events in the world, apparently the way philosophers use the language, those aren't actual disagreements. Actual disagreements are only those cases where no one is arguing about anything. What the hell?
Wow.
So it's like philosophers invert language. It's not even like they're wrong. It's like they take language and they twist and distort it until they do a total 180, where it's like an inversion of practical issues. It's bizarre. And they do this in every area. Consciousness is just one of them. This whole what it's like thing. They take language and they distort it beyond recognition, and then act like, again, I'm using that, act like that. They distort it beyond recognition, present that as the common sense view, and then treat everything else like it's insane. What is going on here? It's bizarre.
A really good example is J.P. Moreland. Wrote a bunch of books and papers. I don't know. He's there's a YouTuber, I think Tom Jump debated him. I can't remember what his name is, but anyway, J.P. Moreland came in his book, talks about homomerous K-masses. And I'm like, what the hell is a homomerous K-mass? It turns out that a homomerous K-mass is if you had a chunk of cheese and you cut the cheese into slices, each one would still be cheese. And he calls it a homomerous K-mass. And I'm like, you are really full of yourself. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. But anyway, disagreements like you and I will say I'm a physicalist. You'll say, oh, I'm not a physicalist. And then we have a disagreement, right? But it turns out we mean the same damn thing at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm just eschewing labels that in certain social contexts carry connotations I'm not comfortable with. You could certainly get me to agree in a conversation in person to be a physicalist, but I do have to be careful about what labels I associate myself with. philosophically, because of the connotations other people will try to pin on you. So
Right.
yeah, we do have a disagreement. The disagreement is what labels we should use, I think.
I guess so. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's maybe not a very interesting disagreement.
Yeah. Part of the reason I call myself that I align with scientism and physicalism and strict naturalism and hard atheism is just to piss them off and get a conversation started. And it works. It works every time. Anyway,
what I will generally say is that I find myself functionally a lot like, I understand why someone would call themselves an agnostic, but I'm not an agnostic. I'm an atheist. I think gods don't exist.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I think that I don't like.
What do you mean by
I don't
God?
think,
Yeah,
I don't think approaches that invoke the supernatural or the non-physical or non-natural properties. I think all of those are absolutely useless. They will never allow us to make any progress on understanding anything, and I completely reject them. Not simply as false, but as utterly useless and a waste of time. And while I enjoy disputing those issues with people, I really actually would prefer if we jettisoned all of that from the discourse and moved on. I would like everybody to be on board with certain sort of ideally, I think the world would probably be better if at least specific religious doctrines, nobody believed them. At least
I agree
specific
with that.
philosophical views, if nobody believed them. I'm hesitant to say like if there was no religion, because I don't actually know the overall psychological consequences of religion, and I don't want to give the impression that I think that if suddenly you just got rid of all religions, that society would be way better. I've become increasingly sympathetic over the years to important aspects of community building and other aspects of that religion brings to people that, I don't think atheists have adequately stepped up to the plate and offered viable functional replacements in practice. Right. I just think they failed to do that. Now, I don't know if that says something deep about our evolved human psychology, or something about the current state of human cultures that I'm familiar with, but I don't know. But I'm not willing to roll the dice that I know better than everybody else. So I'm wary of that. But
there's a whole other discussion about materialism.
I think if we never, look, I'll put it this way. I think if every philosopher was somehow convinced that panpsychism and idealism and dualism are all silly and they stopped endorsing them, I think that would be a step in the right direction.
It would be, yeah. I'm a secular Buddhist, and that's a religion, and with it comes spirituality, prayer, meditation, certain actions and stuff, all perfectly compatible with not believing in the supernatural. And that is the kind of religion that I would vote for, right? Not the kind that believes that people come back from the dead and all this bull. And we're running 2 hours, so we're up against 2 hours. Does that compute?
Yeah. The screen went dark for a minute.
Okay. We're up to
so many technical issues.
We're up to a 2 hour limit. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think in conclusion, I'm really voting for my idea of creating. Well, if you want to talk about consciousness, okay, you don't have to make a decision about whether it's physical or whether it's not. All you have to do is study the brain, study neuroscience, write these scenarios, come up with these timelines, and try to figure out what the hell it is that we're actually talking about. And I would just like to see more of that in philosophy of the mind. I'd like to see a little more Dan Dennett in the beginning, and maybe I don't know if you're familiar with the Churchlands, but they are incredibly. They are brilliant, both of them. Paul and Patricia Churchland. They came up with the crazy idea that we should get rid of folk psychology entirely and change the way we talk. But other than that, they have done some brilliant work. We need more of that. We need more phenomenology. Before we start trying to decide what the hell consciousness is, we have to get rid of this, what it is like, and what Mary knew, and all of this bullshit. And we have to start actually digging into what exactly are we talking about? What are we trying to explain? What do you think we are trying to explain. And that's my request to the philosopher's mind.
Well, I endorse that request. I will note that latter question, what are we talking about? So that's a big question for me. So
yeah,
but what I'll note about that is that's not a direct question about neuroscience. It's not a question directly to like, it's not like you run a study in any direct way to find out what we're talking about. That isn't to say, you know, I mean, a lot of my research is questions about what non-philosophers are talking about, and you can do studies on that. And, you know, that's my biggest issue in philosophy of all the issues is philosophers saying all the non-philosophers, when they say this, that's what they mean. And then no one bothers
they don't know
like,
that.
that's an empirical question. But when you're talking to the philosophers and they say what it's like, I want to know what they mean. And I totally endorse that sort of, if that's an accurate construal, is we need the scientific end to come in and really step up its game and address the issues. And we need greater clarity on what we mean by stuff. But, you know, I am concerned that philosophers will brush off those questions. What do you mean by this? And, you know, I don't know how much, and because we're wrapping up, one of the things they'll say, and maybe you'll have something to say about this, is if you ask them, what do you mean by qualia or a phenomenal state or what it's like, is they may say it's an unanalyzable concept. And if you say, well, what do you mean by unanalyzable? Ultimately, what it comes down to is they're not going to tell you because it's not communicable. There's no way to say what it means. And that's okay.
Ineffable.
It's ineffable because some concepts are meaningful, but their meaning can't be expressed or articulated. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or?
Well, if that's the case, then how do you expect science to explain it? I mean, how do you know? How do you know science hasn't explained it if you can't even linguistically explain what it is we're trying to explain? I mean, I can say fire, and you know what we all, you know, we can start a fire and we can explain the fire. But if you can't tell me what fire in your brain you want me to explain, then of course we can't explain it to you. Anyway, there is no such thing as things we can't explain. Anyway, scientism.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up there. I really appreciate you coming on here. Do you want to plug your channel or say any last things before we close this out?
Yeah, Answers in Atheism needs 20 more subscribers, I think, to get me to 666. And then I'm going to, and I'm going to freeze it right there. And so, you know, I would appreciate some subs. And I am going to try to do better, more organized content. Right now, I am spending all of my time studying neuroscience. That's my devotion for the next 3 to 6 months. I don't know if I'll have time to actually put out content, but God, we are trying. And if not that, we're a wonderful place to have a casual conversation. And we'll put the link out if people request it. You can come in and talk to us about all of these things. So, or anything. Yeah. Okay.
All right. So I will put a link to your channel in the description. So people listening to this, if you enjoy this conversation, you know, head over there and subscribe. We'll hit the 666. I did get a screenshot when I hit 666. So I have that forever now.
Oh, nice. Nice. I want that so bad. And I keep going up and down. Yeah.
Right. It could have been that it skipped over it. Like I wake up in the morning and it's 668. And
I know.
I'm forever stuck with that. Like I'm not going to boot people to get it.
Okay. When I get to 6660, I'm not going to sleep for weeks until I see it.
All right. So thanks everybody. And please like, subscribe, do all the regular things. Check the description for the link to Mike's channel and for all the other links that I ordinarily leave in there. So all my other stuff that you could go check out, like my blog and everything. All right, everybody, take care.